The central figure of Christianity, Jesus, can be identified as Palestinian, and the use of the term Palestine to refer to the historical context in which he lived is indeed coherent. This is due to the fact that, during Jesus' time, the region was known as Palestine, a name that refers to a geographical area that encompasses parts of what we now know as Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. Palestine, in this historical context, was a province of the Roman Empire and had a diverse culture and people. Therefore, when discussing events and figures from that time, the use of the word Palestine is valid and appropriate, considering that it represents the geographical and historical identification of those who inhabited the region. Furthermore, the word helps to contextualize the cultural and social interactions that took place, as well as reflecting the identity of the peoples who lived there. In this way, we can say that the word Palestine not only fits, but also offers a richer understanding of the environment in which Jesus and his contemporaries existed. If the answer is yes, then what was the meaning of this word in times past? The current meaning of the word Palestine is different from what it used to represent. The term, which today is associated with a geographical region and a specific political context, carries a set of historical and social implications that have developed over time. In this way, contemporary Palestine refers not only to a specific area of the Middle East, but also to a national identity and a complex and prolonged conflict involving issues of territoriality, belonging, and human rights. It is therefore essential to consider these nuances when reflecting on the meaning of Palestine at different times. Jesus came into the world in a region that was under the influence and control of the Roman Empire. Is that correct? The territory in question began to be influenced and dominated by the Roman Empire at a fairly significant period in ancient history. This occurred, in general, from the moment the Roman conquests expanded, resulting in the annexation of various regions to the empire, which brought with it an administrative and cultural organization that shaped the places it conquered. Roman domination lasted for many centuries, bringing profound transformations to the culture, economy, and politics of the region. However, this dominance began to decline, and eventually the territory ceased to be under Roman control in a period of crises and invasions, specifically at the end of the 4th century and in the transition to the 5th, when the fragmentation of the Roman Empire occurred, leading to the loss of control over various territories. It was in this context of instability that Roman influence was extinguished, allowing new kingdoms and cultures to emerge in the region. Therefore, our intention will be to answer this question over time, covering the topic in a chronological manner. Isn't that right? From the century before the birth of Christ to almost the present day, there has been an intense debate about the origin of Jesus and the question of whether he can be considered a Palestinian. This discussion covers historical, socio-cultural, and religious aspects, as well as involving different interpretations of the geographical and cultural context in which he lived. Therefore, analyzing the figure of Jesus from this perspective leads us to understand not only his roots, but also how his identity is perceived today. To start this conversation, we can go back to the ancient kingdoms of Judah and Israel, which are present in the Bible, for example, and in other documents too, which were different kingdoms, each with its own ruler, its own foreign policy, its alliances, etc., and one of these kingdoms, which was that of Judah, which was that of Israel, had its own government, its foreign policy, its alliances, etc. And one of these kingdoms, which was that of Israel, had a government of its own, but it didn't have a government of its own, but it did have a government of its own, which was that of Judah. And one of these kingdoms, which is the kingdom of Israel, will be overthrown by the Assyrians by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC. So in the 6th century, we no longer have the kingdom of Israel and we only have the kingdom of Judah. So in the 6th century BC, the Neo-Iranian Empire will invade the region of Judah as well and destroy and defeat the kingdom of Judah. And from then on, that region will become a province of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar I, who also appears there in the biblical texts. This is the period of the Babylonian exile, etc. So we no longer have either the kingdom of Judah or the kingdom of Israel. We have a province called the province of Arad, which is a province of the Babylonian Empire. But history continues, and the Babylonian or Neo-Babylonian Empire will also fall into the hands of another adversary, which are the Persians, with Cyrus the Great, and then the Babylonian province of Herod becomes a Persian province, the Persian province of Herod, which we can call the province of Judea. And of course the Persians don't last forever either. They are defeated by Alexander the Great, right of the Macedonian Empire or the Greek Empire, if you prefer, and consequently this region becomes the domain of the Greeks. In more detail, it should be noted that this particular region will be under the control of one of the generals who served Alexander the Great. This is because Alexander dies without having left a successor who is considered strong enough to guarantee the continuity of his unified empire. As a result of his death, His vast empire will be fragmented and divided between the most prominent generals in his command. Specifically, the part that encompassed the province of Judea would end up under the rule of the Seleucids. Therefore, what is known as the Seleucid Empire, or even the Seleucid dynasty, will be in charge of administering this territory. Within this dynasty, one of its leaders, named Antiochus IV, would initiate a series of policies aimed at Hellenization, with the aim of intensely promoting Greek culture in the Judean region. However, this attempt at cultural imposition will meet with strong resistance from various groups of Jews living in the area, who will not passively accept the influence of Greek culture imposed by Antiochus IV. In response to this cultural oppression, they will start an uprising known as the Revolt of the Maccabees, which will become an important mark of resistance. In this historical context, during the course of this process, this revolt will manifest itself in an intense and comprehensive way, which will lead to the removal of the Seleucid control that had dominated the Judean region until then. As a result of this insurrection, a new dynasty will rise, characterized exclusively by Jews, and this dynasty will be called the Hasmoneans. This change will signify an important milestone in the history of the region, as the Hasmonean dynasty will take the reins of power and influence the Jewish future in the area. The question that arises is that, as time progresses, it's quite likely that some internal disagreements or conflicts will arise between the members of the Hasmonean dynasty, isn't it? Conflicts regarding succession, right? When a king passes away, a dispute inevitably arises as to who will assume the position and occupy the throne, doesn't it? This succession process often generates heated discussions and rivalries between potential heirs, reflecting the importance of power and leadership in society. Thus, in one of the many conflicts related to the succession to the throne, two aspirants to the title of king of the Hasmonean dynasty, which is made up of members of this royal family, decided to seek outside help in order to overcome their rival in the contest for power. Both candidates resorted to the intervention of the Roman Republic, which at the time was still in its republican period, and this led an important Roman general, known by the name of Pompey, to travel to the region to intervene in the tumultuous situation. After a confrontation, Pompey managed to defeat one of the Hasmonean candidates, while establishing the other as a client king. This process meant that the figure who remained in power did not assume the position of a sovereign king with full rights, but rather as a vassal, in other words, a ruler subordinate to the interests and authority of Rome. Thus, in the course of this intense dispute over the succession to the throne, an outcome was reached in which none of the candidates became the absolute king and, as a result, from that moment on, the city of Rome was consolidated as the new ruler over the reins. During the 1st century before the Common Era, a significant historical event took place. The region known as the province of Judea came under the rule of the Roman Empire. This change of control is an important milestone of that time, reflecting the political and social transformations that took place during that period. However, the truth is that there were still kings among the Jews, weren't there? However, it's important to clarify that the monarchs, such as the famous King Herod, who is mentioned in the scriptures of the Bible, among others, belonged to a group of Jewish kings. These rulers were actually considered client kings, weren't they? Vassals who were not in line or who disagreed with Roman policy were therefore liable to be replaced, which implies that, in reality, control over the region was in the hands of the Romans. This means that administration and local governance were effectively exercised by Roman representatives, thus ensuring that Rome's interests were prioritized in the management of the provinces. Hello, I hope you're well. Now let's look at Vinicius' question. At what point did the city of Rome, which had exercised its powerful influence and dominion for so long, lose this power over the region in question? What happens is that, at certain moments in history, Rome temporarily loses control over the region in question. But these occurrences of lack of control take place over a relatively short period of time, caused mainly by local revolts and insurrections. A significant example of these revolts is the famous Bar Kokhba revolt, which took place during a time when a messianic figure emerged in the 6th century AD, managing to dethrone Roman power and establish a Jewish government, including a sovereign state, which lasted for approximately 3 years. However, this situation of autonomy did not last, as Rome managed to retake the region under the command of Emperor Hadrian. It's important to remember this context, as we're going to address the issue of the name Palestine later on. Here, there is an idea that we will discuss, questioning its validity: the notion that Hadrian changed the name of the area that had previously been called Judea to Syria-Palestine. From that moment on, the region began to be recognized as Palestine. We will soon have the opportunity to confirm the veracity of this claim, but before we delve into the issue, it is important to note that during the period when Hadrian ruled, Rome took the initiative to retake control of the region after defeating the Bar Kokhba revolt. This dominion was maintained for a long time, extending for many centuries after this event. However, Towards the end of the 4th century, the political landscape changed dramatically as the great Roman Empire began to fragment, an event that marked the end of an era and the beginning of new geopolitical dynamics. This was when the Roman Empire was officially divided into two distinct parts, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. It's important to emphasize that during the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire faced a significant collapse and eventually succumbed. The conventionally accepted dating for this historical event is the year 476 after Christ, but it is important to emphasize that this process of determining dates is quite complex and not a simple task, and there is great difficulty in establishing an exact date with precision. However, regardless of other considerations, the Western Roman Empire inevitably disintegrated, while the Eastern Roman Empire, which later came to be known as the Byzantine Empire, managed to remain in operation for a longer period. It's worth noting that it was precisely this eastern portion of the old Roman Empire that had control over the area of Judea, which is also known as the region of Palestine. Furthermore, when the Eastern Roman Empire loses this authority over the aforementioned area, it will be due to the expansion of Islam. In other words, Islam begins to spread across the Arabian Peninsula, with its growth especially significant in the 6th century AD. During his journey, he will have the opportunity to come up against the Byzantine Empire, one of the great powers of the time, and will triumph over the Byzantines in several warlike confrontations. As a result of these victories, he will be able to establish his dominion over the region, a feat that will take place in the year 636 of the Christian era. Christ is a central figure of enormous importance in the Christian religion, revered as the Son of God and the Savior of humanity. His life, his teachings, and his death on the cross are fundamental to the principles of Christianity, which preaches values such as love, forgiveness, and the search for faith. In addition, Christ is considered the Messiah by many religious traditions and plays a crucial role in the spirituality and religiously devoted practices of the communities that follow his teachings. His resurrection and the hope it represents are also pillars of belief for millions of people around the world. In more detail, the caliphate that is referred to as the Orthodox Caliphate will be responsible for taking control of the region in question, removing it from the clutches of the Byzantine Empire, which until then had held sway. Subsequently, a succession of other caliphates also managed to establish their control over the area. After this period, the Mamluks, a powerful military class, took command of the region. Then it was the turn of the Ottoman Turks, who rose to prominence and gained control of the region, continuing the instability and political changes that have characterized this territory throughout history. Subsequently, the Ottoman Turkish Empire began to exercise its dominion over the region, and when it was defeated in the First World War, control was transferred to the British. Later, in 1947, the United Nations Organization, UNO, proposed a plan to divide the territory of Palestine, suggesting that the area be divided into two parts, one for the Arabs and the other for the Jews. From that point on, a sequence of local conflicts was unleashed, which undoubtedly had the significant participation of international actors throughout the process. This is how we arrived at the complex and troubled context we know today, isn't it? So, to briefly summarize what we've discussed so far, and taking into account the question posed by Vinicius, it's important to point out that Rome, in fact, loses its influence and dominion over the historical area known as Palestine. And here it's worth reflecting on whether to use inverted commas or not, when the Byzantines are defeated by the Orthodox Caliphate, which is considered to be the first caliphate to emerge after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, who consequently takes control of that region. Now we can move on to the next part of the video, where we will discuss the question of whether or not we should use inverted commas when referring to Palestine. In order to understand the origin of the name Palestine and whether this denomination was applied throughout all the periods I mentioned earlier, it is essential that we begin our discussion by addressing the issue of naming places, isn't it? This analysis is fundamental, since the name of a place carries with it a rich history and a series of meanings that can vary over time and historical circumstances. Thus, understanding the evolution and use of this name in different periods will give us a clearer view of its relevance and historical implications. When we analyze historical sources that deal with geographical place names and their respective geographical divisions or boundaries, we realize that the accuracy of this information is not as high as we would like it to be. For this reason, we haven't been able to find maps that are as accurate as, for example, a world map dating from the 1st century, or even a world map representing the medieval period. It's also important to mention that even though there are maps from this period, they don't have the same detailed characteristics as we would like. In fact, these maps, although they do exist, don't resemble what we have today with high precision. I'm going to project it onto the screen, okay? It's not particularly useful to have detailed knowledge of geographical restrictions, since it's also important to note that each ethnic or cultural group had its own vision and understanding of the territories that were considered to exist. There were international agreements that had such a strict definition that they established territorial boundaries in a consensual and extremely clear manner, in the same way that we see today in many situations. Therefore, when we analyze the issue of Palestine, for example, we can find several examples that illustrate this complexity. It's important to emphasize that we shouldn't get into total relativism. I'm just mentioning that reality is a little more imprecise than we'd like to believe. However, when we examine the situation regarding Palestine, we already find references to a people known as the Palestinians in documents from Egypt dating back to the 16th century. Oxy, in the year 11 before the Common Era, also known as 11 BC, marks a specific point in the historical chronology. It is a period that falls within the series of years that precede the beginning of the Western calendar, which is commonly associated with the birth of Jesus Christ and therefore with the beginning of our era. In the historical context, these years are often referred to in order to describe events, civilizations, and localities that existed and developed before the symbolic date that separates the two great periods of our history. In this way, the year 11 BC represents a period of time that has significant relevance for the study of the cultural, political, and social practices of the civilizations that flourished in antiquity. Thus, we can see that there is a mention of the land of the Palestinians, which is quite possibly related to the Philistines, an ethnic group that lived in the area that would later be called Palestine, known for its rich history and culture. This identification highlights the connection between the Philistines and the geography of that time, offering a perspective on the presence of these peoples in the formation of the region. In this way, it is important to emphasize that the term referring to Palestine has an extremely ancient usage, dating back to periods dating back to the 10th century BC. However, we don't have a clear understanding of what exactly the ancient Egyptians meant by the term land of the Philistines. This leads us to inquire about the meaning of this expression and the intentions behind it, which remain obscure to this day as we try to better understand this part of history. What specific part of geographical space were they alluding to, exactly? It's quite likely that the area in question referred to a region that was located closer to the coast, specifically to the south of the location mentioned. The terms Palota, as well as Pastu and Pilu, are mentioned in texts from ancient Assyria, dating back to the 8th and 6th centuries BC. This indicates that these words may be related to the region inhabited by the Philistines. It's worth noting that in Hebrew, the Philistines are designated by the term skins, which reveals a significant connection with the name Palestine itself. However, it's important to note that even so, the Assyrian documents don't offer a very detailed or precise description of the land in question, which is recognized as the homeland of the children. Do you agree? What is the area occupied by this land? And from this point, we begin to access slightly more current documents, which will provide us with additional information that will help us to better understand what individuals were referring to when they mentioned Palestine. A significant example is Herodotus, a historian from Greece who lived in the 5th century BC. He is notable because he already used the word Palestine as a way of referring to an expanse of land located between the regions of Syria and Egypt. This use of terminology reveals a geographical understanding of the time and the historical importance of that area. Once again, we are unclear about the exact width of this strip of land. It is possible that he is referring only to the region of the coastal margin of the Mediterranean Sea, which covers the area between the countries of Syria and Egypt, or he could be referring to an even more extensive region, which would include other locations, such as the Dead Sea, for example. The question that arises is whether the focus of the discussion is restricted to this narrow strip of coastline or whether, in fact, it covers adjacent regions that could encompass other significant bodies of water. In Herodotus' work, it is regrettable to note that the clarity of the information is rather limited. However, it is important to note that the word in question was already appearing on a continuous basis, as it had been visible since the 11th century BC. In addition, there are several other writers, both from Greece and Rome, whose work could be mentioned to help in the search for a more precise geographical definition of this term. However, I have decided to focus on two authors that I find particularly fascinating and who are of Jewish origin, Philo of Alexandria and Flavius Josephus. Both authors lived in the 1st century of the Christian era, which means that they had their experiences and writings before the reign of Emperor Hadrian, thus offering a valuable perspective on the time. It is important to emphasize that there is a historical conception that attributes to the Emperor Hadrian the action of being the first to name the territory that encompassed Palestine or Syria, referring to it as Palestine. This decision was considered a significant offense to the Jewish community of the time. Therefore, throughout this text, you will observe how the Jews used the term Palestine during the 1st century of the Christian era, taking into account all the contexts and meanings that this term may have taken on in that specific period. Philon, in his work, mentions that, in addition to the aspects already discussed, the regions of Palestine and Syria do indeed possess a remarkable wealth in terms of wisdom and virtues that are worthy of consideration. These areas are home to a significant fraction of the vast Jewish population, which is quite numerous. It is important to note that, within this context, there is a specific group of individuals known as the Essenes, who are mentioned in the text and with whom he is drawing relevant comparisons. In this way, Philon's analysis covers both the cultural and spiritual richness of these regions and the presence of these specific groups of people who stand out for their particular characteristics. And he's putting the Jews on an equal footing, at the very least, or perhaps even superior to the culture of the Greeks and the Egyptians. And then he says that in Palestine there is also wisdom and virtue, and he highlights a specific people, the Essenes, who are Jews who inhabited this territory of Syria and Palestine. And the ancient texts generally place the Essenes, Pliny the Elder, for example, places the Essenes around the Dead Sea. So we're not talking about a narrow strip there in the Mediterranean, but we're talking about a wider strip of land between Syria and Egypt. And Philo also says the following in another text, that more than 4,000 Essenes live in Palestine and Syria, more precisely in many towns in Judea, in many villages and grouped together in large societies with many members. So Philo is placing Judea, the cities of Judea, within a larger territory, which is the territory of Syria and Palestine. If you have any doubts about this interpretation I've just made here, we can consult another text on the life of Moses, in which Philo says the following. Moses is talking about the Exodus. Moses led his people as a colony to Phoenicia and to Syria and Palestine, which at that time was called the land of the Canaanites, whose borders were a 3-day journey from Egypt. In fact, Syria refers to a country located in the Middle East, which is bordered to the north by Turkey, to the east by Iraq, to the south by Jordan, and to the west by Lebanon and the Mediterranean Sea. Therefore, it cannot be said that Syria is only the northern part of Syria, as the term covers the whole of Syrian territory as a whole. Thus, when dealing with the subject of the Exodus, Philo mentions that Moses led the people on their journey to the region known as Phoenicia, passing through the town called Seli and on to Palestine. Josephus wrote several books, among them a book called Antiquities of the Jews or Jewish Antiquities, a book that talks about the entire history of the Jews, from Adam to the days of Flavius Josephus. And he ends this book with the following words: these antiquities contain what has been given to us, handed down from the original creation of man until the 12th year of Nero's reign, regarding what happened to us Jews, both in Egypt and in Syria and Palestine, and the geographical scope analyzed by Flavius Josephus in Antiquity of the Jews, which obviously includes the region of Judea, includes the region of the ancient kingdoms of Judah and Israel. He places Egypt, Syria, and Palestine in this scope. So once again we see the term Palestine being used to refer to a macro region that encompasses Judea. And yet another quote from Josephus. But there is an interesting moment when he says the following. Neither Herodotus of Halicarnassus, who is our 5th century Greek historian that we've already talked about, nor Herodotus of Halicarnassus was unaware of our nation, the Jews, but he mentions their nation in this way. So, that's why Herodotus says that the Syrians who are in Palestine are circumcised, and then Josephus comments on this passage from Herodotus by saying, but there are no inhabitants of Palestine who are circumcised except the Jews, and so it must be his knowledge of them that allowed him to speak so much about them, right? It is essential to consider that the understanding that the Jews possess may have been the reason that enabled Joseph to express himself about the Syrians who inhabit the region of Palestine. These individuals, in fact, correspond to the identification of the Jews themselves, including those who live in Judea, which is an important part of this context. Let's return to the idea that Hadrian, the Roman emperor, is often mentioned as the pioneer who named the region Palestine, using the denomination Syria-Palestine. This action would have been carried out as a form of provocation or disdain towards the Jewish people. It is common to say that, after suppressing the Jewish revolt, he changed the name of the province of Judea to Syria-Palestine, with the intention of breaking the connection between the land and its people, in other words, dissociating the traditionally Jewish land from its inherent Jewish identity. There are 2 examples that illustrate this point. Flavius Josephus and Philo, both mentioned, use the word Palestine in a totally relaxed manner and without any embarrassment whatsoever, to designate a vast macro-region that includes the area of Judea. As well as using the terminology Palestine, they often use this same word in conjunction with the term Syria, reaffirming the connection between these geographical designations without hesitation. The territory known as Judea is included in this analysis, and it is worth emphasizing that the use of this term was already common practice at the time. Therefore, the Emperor Hadrian was not creating a new or original term. Furthermore, if he had in fact changed the name, we will also investigate the possibility of a change in denomination. For example, if he had chosen to replace the name Judea with that of Syria, this choice would actually be in line with a name that was already used by the Jews of that period. So I see no reason to interpret this name change, which supposedly took place, as a form of disrespect or offense. And why am I mentioning a change that is presumed to be true in this situation? In reality, we can state that we do not in any way possess any document or historical record that proves that Hadrian changed the name of Judea to Syria Palestine with the intention of offending or disrespecting the Jewish people. What's more, we're not even sure if Hadrian was responsible for this change in the name of the province, nor if this change in nomenclature actually took place. What we can see is that the expression Syrian Palestine appears much more frequently in periods after Hadrian's administration, compared to its occurrence in the times that preceded it. In ancient Palestine and Judea, which continued to be used as geographical designations even after the era of Emperor Hadrian, we can see that various authors, many of whom were Christians, referred to these regions. A notable example is Epiphanius of Salamis, an author who lived in a period that we can identify and is important for understanding this nomenclature. He mentions that, during his travels, Hadrian passed through the city of Anch, which is located in the region of Syria, and also traveled through Phoenicia until he reached Palestine, which, interchangeably, is also known as Judea. This shows that both Palestine and Judea were widely used and accepted labels. It's worth pointing out that, in ancient times, the standardization of geographical names were much less common practices compared to today, which means that there was more flexibility in the use of different designations for the same place. The phenomenon of several people or groups using the same nomenclature to designate a geographical region is actually quite an unusual occurrence, isn't it? This uniformity in the use of a specific name by different individuals or communities in relation to a particular place is something we don't see very often. There are many individuals who use different names to refer to the same geographical area, and this is even more evident in specific contexts. For example, among the Jews who inhabited the region of Judea, some often referred to the place as Judea, while others called it Syria Palestine. Additionally, there were those who considered Judea to be an integral part of Syria Palestine. So, at the beginning of this video session, I was commenting precisely on this complexity. The geographical nomenclature of antiquity presents a remarkable imprecision and instability that is much greater than we might idealize or wish it to be. I realize that this situation can be unpleasant for people who yearn for a certainty that is completely clear and definitive in relation to the subject in question. Like them, I would also like to be able to offer this clarity, but reality doesn't present itself in this way, either in positive or negative terms. So, in order to delve a little deeper into the discussion on the use of the term Palestine, and so that we can consider the question of whether Jesus could be considered Palestinian, which is a concept that generates debate, I would like to briefly present a series of maps. I don't intend to describe each of the maps individually. In fact, I'm just going to display them on the screen. This way, those who are interested can pause the presentation later to analyze them properly. These maps include cartographic representations from the 15th century, the 16th century, the 10th century, the 16th century again, the 19th century and the 20th century, both before and after the partition of Palestine. The territorial division of Palestine, which designates all the space between Syria and Egypt as Palestine, is a subject that goes back quite a long way in history. This nomenclature is often accompanied by cartographic representations that illustrate Palestine as the Promised Land, which reinforces the idea of its historical and cultural significance. It has therefore been agreed over the centuries that this vast geographical area, which is home to a diversity of peoples, cultures, and traditions, should be called Palestine. This region is not limited to a single group, but encompasses a variety of kingdoms, states, and provinces that coexist and share this common geographical identity, thus reflecting the complexity and richness of its multifaceted history. Palestine is an extensive geographical area that, throughout history, has been called that for countless generations, and was called that for many centuries, both before and after the Emperor Hadrian lived. To illustrate this point, I once produced a video on the subject, which I believe is available on the channel entitled Cortez. In fact, I mentioned that I used the expression Palestine when discussing the provenance of Aramaic, which is a Semitic language. Recently, someone made a comment that caught my attention. They questioned the use of the term Palestine, implying that the way it is used today may be related to some aspects of the contemporary context. This person seems to be unaware that the term Palestine has been conventionally used for a long time, long before the current configuration of the conflict between Israel and Palestine was even considered, isn't it? This observation reveals a lack of understanding of the history and use of the term over time. It is therefore important to point out that the term Palestine is widely used and recognized in the historical narrative related to religions, as well as in the trajectory of the ancient Near East, and is a terminology that has endured for many centuries. Therefore, in my role as a historian, both personally and professionally, I see no impediment in stating that Jesus can be considered a saint, as long as we have a clear understanding of the context in which this statement is made. The assertion that Jesus could not be considered Palestinian, and therefore not Jewish, is actually incorrect. Jesus was, in fact, of Jewish origin and was born in the historical region known as Palestine. This region encompassed Judea and was recognized by the name of Palestine long before the era of Emperor Hadrian. In reality, Palestine, located in this large area that was also called Syria, was already referred to as such in earlier periods, during the Roman Empire, and this denomination was maintained well beyond Hadrian's reign. Therefore, taking this analysis into account, it is correct to say that Jesus was a Jew and also that he can be classified as a Palestinian Jew, given that he lived and was born in this geographical and cultural context. However, that's all the information available, isn't it? I hope my answer has clarified the issue of Jesus being identified as Palestinian, as well as other similar questions that have arisen over time. I would like to invite everyone to leave their criticisms and counter-arguments in the comments, as your opinion is very important. This way we can continue our discussion in a productive and enriching way, and I hope we can meet again in the next videos. May the Lord bless you intensely and abundantly, with many blessings in your lives.